Gracious God, you have included us in your great plan to gather all things back to you again. As we live in this broken world, as we see the results of sin and selfishness in our own lives, in our own families, and in the lives of our communities, in the life of our nation, in the life of this world, we ask that you use us. Inspire us to carve a space in our lives that you can occupy. To carve a space in our lives that we can hear you and respond to your call. We give you thanks that we can study your word today. And may our words and our thoughts be pleasing to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Welcome. And so we are just in, first of all, thank you to Mike, who covered for me last week, and I watched his session, and it was wonderful, and so we very much appreciate it, and it's nice to know that we can do that when necessary. So it is a blessing to team teach every once in a while, so that's kind of fun. So as we move forward a little bit, again, just as a quick reminder, what is God's intention for this world? And this is God's intention for this world, that we see God as King in our lives, that we were created with our hands up in the air. We were created as people of worship and then people of service as well. That part down there is not two kneeling people there are not there to worship. That is the stance of service, and that our work is created to be in unity. And of course, what happens is that when sin enters into this world, and that good Martin Luther definition of sin, which is love curved in on itself, enters in this world, then all of a sudden all of this breaks down. And I'm not going to go through all of this. We've talked about this a number of times. And Mike spent a good amount of time covering this idea that God, in God's plan, to take that brokenness and begin a plan to gather us back up. And all of this represented these first 11 chapters of Genesis, the sin of disobedience and God's judgment, but God acts in grace. This idea that God's grace was not invented for the New Testament, that God's grace is there present in the Old Testament as well, and these that sort of cycle of sin and then God's judgment. However, God's grace, and Mike covered that very, very well last week. And then Mike also talked about this whole idea. So we get to this point here, and so this final one where this the sin is that humanity has become arrogant, and humanity desires to build its way up to God. And that story in Genesis 11, which we know as the Tower of Babel, is an amusing story if you take a look at it. That the people down on earth are just, so busy. They're like little ants, and they're trying to build this thing all the way up to God, and God looks down upon it, and God doesn't even know what they're doing. It is like, it's like watching ants, and you presume to think that they're up to something, but you can't tell because it's at such a small scale, and that's exactly how Genesis chapter 11 is. And God has to come down and say, "What are you guys up to?" And realizes that this is not a good thing, and so he kind of breaks apart the community as part of the judgment, the dispersal, gives different languages, so people couldn't communicate with each other. But yet acts in grace. And that acting in grace is then this story of Abraham. Genesis chapter 12 begins the story of redemption. And it begins with Abraham and Sarah. And I've been talking a great deal about that in my sermon, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about it now. But this whole idea that God comes to Abraham and Sarah and comes to them in a what is called a covenant or a promise. And this covenant has three parts to it. God, kind of out of the blue, appears to this old man and this old woman and says, I go to the place that I will show you, and I will give you that land. So land is part of that promise that God makes here. And then he said, then I will make of you a great nation. And of course, that's quite an accomplishment for an old man and an old woman who have no children. And then through you, through descendancy, I will bless the entire world. And so those are the three parts of that promise, that cup of blessing which pours upon the world, that comes out of the descendancy of Abraham. And then as this peculiar story in Genesis, I think it's Genesis chapter 15, of how God cements that promise, that flaming torch, that coal pot, that Abraham has that dream, and it is, where he says, go out and get these animals and split them in half, and then God's self, represented by the torch and the coal pot, kind of waddles its way in between those parted animals. And basically communicating the thing, at least that's what it was in that particular culture, that God says, if I break this promise, that you can do this to me. You can split me in half. And that's how God cements that covenant, that cements that promise then to Abraham and his descendancy. And so the rest of the Bible, to a certain extent, is this story about how God fulfills these three promises. And it starts, of course, with the birth of Isaac, the miraculous birth of Isaac. Abraham is 100 years old, and Sarah is very, very close to that and has that first child. And then through Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, and then Jacob has the 12 sons, of which become the 12 tribes of Israel. And this family grows and it grows and it grows. And so it is this beginning of the fulfillment of these promises that God has made. And so as we move forward now to this, we move to what is next. And this is a representation of what happens next in Scripture. And Mike, you did not get to this at all, did you? And so this is the story of Exodus. Now, again, Genesis is actually a really, really good read. There are things in the Bible, there are books of the Bible that are, a little bit on the dry side, or if you don't have the context of it and the meanings behind it, it can be a little bit dry. Genesis isn't that way. Genesis is just interesting. And Genesis is this story, that of Isaac first, and then Jacob, and Jacob and his trickery. And then it becomes basically the story of one of Jacob's sons, who is Joseph. And Joseph, becomes, and this is the story of Joseph and how Joseph becomes kind of the favorite son of Jacob, who is now called Israel. Jacob's name has been changed to Israel. Remember, the name Jacob means trickster. And of course, early on in that story of Jacob, he very much fulfills that name. And then at the end of the Jacob story, his name is changed to Israel. And the word Israel literally means he who struggles with God, he who wrestles with God. And so Israel has these 12 sons. Jacob/Israel has these 12 sons, and the favorite son becomes this Joseph. And of course, for those of you that have multiple children, If you have a favorite one out of all of them, even as you try to hide that fact, it seems to show up, and the rest of those brothers become very jealous, sell him into slavery, if you recall that story. And as he's sold into slavery, he is taken by Midianite traders, and he is then he is sold to Egypt. And I'm to be kind of crinkly back there. I don't know why. We're still trying to figure out our new sound system and all of this. Anyway, so Joseph ends up as a slave in Egypt. But of course, you know that story too. Joseph has this ability to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh has this dream, and remember what the dream is. You know, the dream of Pharaoh is that he dreams that there is that out of the river Nile comes 7 really, really fat cattle, super fat, super healthy looking, super fat cattle, and then what follows afterwards is 7 famished cattle that are so skinny they look like they're starving to death. And those 7 starving cattle gobble up the 7 fat cattle. And poor Pharaoh doesn't know what the heck this means. He has this dream multiple times. And as he has this dream multiple times, he is... he says, who can interpret this dream? And someone says, well, this Joseph has the ability to interpret dreams. And so Joseph goes in and interprets this dream, and he says, this is what it means. There'll be 7 years of phenomenal harvests, and there'll be 7 years of famine. And so they said, fine, the 7 years of harvest come, and they store up all of this grain, preparing for these 7 years of famine. And all of a sudden, Egypt becomes the only place in the known world that has food when this famine comes. And everyone else is dying of starvation, including the rest of the brothers of Joseph. And they, of course, by this time, they think Joseph is long dead. But they have to go. They've heard that Egypt has food and they don't have any, and so they go to Egypt to buy food. And there's this wonderful story in Genesis how they actually meet with Joseph himself. But of course, by this time, decades have passed, and Joseph speaks fluent Egyptian, and he looks like an Egyptian. He doesn't look like a Hebrew anymore. And they negotiate with Joseph, not even knowing that it's Joseph. And in the end of the story of Genesis, that Joseph reveals himself. Hey guys, it's me, and he invites the whole family to come and live with him in Egypt. That's how the descendancy of Abraham ends up in Egypt. That's where they are at the end of this story, or at the end of Genesis. And things go well because, by that time, Joseph is second in command. God has blessed him in that particular way. And and Pharaoh, he does this with the appreciation of Pharaoh. But over time, the Hebrew people, this descendancy of Abraham, continues to grow and grow and grow. And the succeeding generations of pharaohs become more and more distrustful. What's going on with this Hebrew population? So distrustful that the Pharaoh decides the only way to control it is to enslave those people. And that's how they become slaves in Egypt. And so Exodus chapter 1 is the story of how this blessing turned into this curse of slavery, and how not only are they made slaves, but even in their slavery they continue to grow in population, and so Pharaoh makes the order to say that, well, we need to start culling that population, and he sends the word out that all male children less than 2 years old need to be killed. And he sends that order out. But that story of Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2 about these, but the Hebrew midwives, and there's this story of Puah and Shipra, these two Hebrew midwives hide the children, or when the soldiers come, they know that someone's giving birth, and they hide these children. They lie to the officials, and they say, well, we just didn't get here in time. The child was already born, and these Hebrew women are strong. They don't even need us, and so they continue with that. And then, of course, that story of Moses and the birth of Moses. And what does Moses' mother do to make sure that Moses isn't one of those that is killed? And, then the rest of it's the movie of the Ten Commandments, and you guys have seen that, and I don't need to go into any of them. So this is the story then of this thing. So we know that the descendancy of Abraham has become a great nation. There's a lot of Hebrews here. There's a lot of Israelites here, and so they've become a great nation. But what they don't have is land yet. That land that God had promised them, which is the land of Canaan. And so Exodus chapter 1 begins with them being in slavery in Egypt. And so what's going to happen? And of course, you know that story. Moses discovers that he is indeed one of the Hebrews, and in a fit of anger, he kills one of the Egyptian overseers, and Moses himself has to flee for his life and begins a new life among the tribe of the Midianites, and falls in love with the daughter of Jethro, who is the head of the Midianites, and Moses begins a new life. And of course, what happens after that is, and according to the book of Hebrews, that he is there for 40 years. And again, the Bible uses the word 40 and uses the number 40 to communicate that he was there for the correct amount of time, in fullness of time. And so after 40 years had passed, after the right amount of time has passed, you have that story of the call of Moses, through that burning bush. Go back to my people. And of course, Moses tries to avoid that at any cost, gives 5 different reasons why he shouldn't go back. Finally, God just gets angry and says, go back. It is your job to do this. And Moses goes, and he leads his people, leads God's people out of slavery. And so if you take a look at all of the different pieces of all of this, that piece there, that chain around, and I hope you realize that Nile Delta right there, and the people who are living in slavery right there, that stands for the slavery. And God is acting. God hears their cry. And so God acts in such a way that he breaks apart Pharaoh, that he defeats Pharaoh's army in that marvelous act of going through the Red Sea and of all those 10 plagues that take place. And God acts out of God's love for God's people. And so they then are now free, but they are free but they're in the and they're going to be in the wilderness for a good long time. And so the very first thing they did do is, now if you take a look at the map here, if they were on their way to the promised land, then that would mean that the shortest possible path would be to go along the shoreline there, from Egypt all the way up to here. And I don't know how many miles it is. My guess is it's only probably about 150 miles probably, and the shortest possible path. It's not that far. And even if you have as many people as the book of Numbers says we have right here, which is about 600,000, that's a pretty substantial amount of people. Even if you could only move a few miles a day to get from Egypt to the promised land, it would take you about a month, maybe. but that's not the path that God has them on. And so as they are freed from their slavery to, and Pharaoh's armies have been defeated, but they are in the wilderness, and of course then that whole story of which we heard last week, Vicar Sue preached about the people begin to complain. They say, well, we're out here in the wilderness, we should have, so you freed us from Egypt to kill us here in the wilderness, by starvation. And there was the whole committee that said, we would rather. And so what had happened with this is that, this whole idea of this committee that said, well, then we just need to go back to Egypt. Our lives were so much better in slavery. We were slaves, yes, but at least we had food. And I always get a kick out of it because a lot of preachers talk about this. He says that every church has a go back to Egypt committee in it that says, oh, life was so much better, back in there. We may have had our shortcomings, but at least we had something to eat, in the midst of all of that. And that go back to Egypt committee it was strong there, and God says, no, I will provide for you here. And so if you think about how this works, you have 600,000 people in a place that does not have a Walmart, in a place that does not have any kind of way to sustain it. It is the wilderness. It is the desert. It is the most kind of uninhabitable place you can think of. No water, no natural forms of food. God has to provide. And God does provide. Every morning God sends this bread-like stuff that covers the entire camp, something that becomes known as manna. And he tells the people, you can go out every morning and collect as much as you need for that day. And they said, if you collect more than you need, it's going to rot. You will always have enough. And then in the evening, he sends meat, and in the form of these what kind of quail, and he says, go out and collect as much as you need for that day. The only exception is that on Friday evenings you can collect twice as much, so that you can celebrate Sabbath. And for really the next 40 years, God provides every morsel of food and every drop of water for this community. But that wasn't the original plan. And hopefully this will come up. Is the computer booting back up again, Sue? Okay. And so the original plan is that they would go. Now, do you have your books along so you can follow along on that? And until we're up and running, and you can take a look at that. So God leads them. He leads them by a cloud during the day and during the night through a pillar of fire. Leads them not along the coast, which would be the shortest way to go to the Promised Land, but he goes south to the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, to what becomes known as Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, and so when he gets to Mount Sinai and Mount Horeb, the whole idea is then now that God is going to be giving them in this new community what they need to thrive as a community. And so as they come down to Mount Sinai, and you'll take a look at all of the little things that are here in the midst of it, and it looks like we're back up again. All right, it's just taking a little bit of time for the program to get back up again. And you'll see that little mountain in the end. And what's on top of that is, God appears to them in a cloud. And then God then gives them, and if you take a look at what's in the midst of that triangle there, which represents the Mount Sinai, is that tablet. Basically, God makes a new covenant with them, and we'll talk about the specifics of that covenant in just a little bit. Of that covenant, now this is more than just the 10 commandments. There are 613 commandments that God gives for this community. And the overwhelming majority of these commandments has to do with what is best for the community. And so you see that little circle of circles there, those little things that looks like a pearl necklace that's around there. And what that stands for is the community that God is providing for here. Not only the provision of every morsel of food and every drop of water, but God is then giving them what they need to not only just survive as community, but to thrive as community. What needs to take place that this community can thrive? And so that's what part of that law has everything to do about. And then, of course, the worship aspect of it. You look down there at the bottom, it's still inside that little pearl necklace there, is what is known as the tabernacle. And actually, I'm going to be talking about the tabernacle today in my sermon today. And that tabernacle is the forerunner for the temple, that place of worship. That tabernacle is that place where God holds court, I guess is the best way to put it, is where heaven and earth, where they meet. And in that tabernacle is where Moses and then the Levite priests, they can go in and hear from God. And that is the place of sacrifice. And it is, again, the forerunner to what will be the temple in Jerusalem. And then you have this story. So they hang out. There we go. Thank you very, very much. They hang out in Jerusalem on Mount Sinai. They hang out for about a year. And they are there. That's where they receive all of the laws. That is where the rules of worship are established. That's where the community then is fortified. And then after they have received that, they set off now for the promised land. And again, we're talking about a trip that if one person were walking this, probably would take 4 or 5 days. This is not something that should take that long. Now, of course, you have 600,000 people, and to mobilize 600,000 people. For those of you that grew up in big families and are trying to get that family out of the house for church on Sunday morning, you know that how much it takes to get a family of 6 out the door on time. Now you have 600,000 people. So it's going to take a while. At best case scenario, you can probably kind of waddle along there for maybe 3-4 miles a day with that many people, and then you got to stop and set up camp and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, this is something that should take, months, maybe a month and a half. And actually, it does. And they get now on their initial trip up to the promised land, which you can see where that arrow is pointing to. That is the land of Canaan. They get to a point on that promised land which is about right here. To a place that is, the name of the place is called Kadesh Barnea. And when they get to that place, there's this fascinating story. In fact, I'm going to ask you to open up the Bibles that are in front of you. Numbers chapter 13. This fascinating story of Kadesh Barnea. And in this, they get that far. Now, they're within sight of the promised land, and Moses has a good idea. He says, you know what? We should probably scout this place out. Before we come marching in there, we better know where the best place to cross into it is going to be. we need to have a little scouting that's taking place. So look at the book of Numbers, which is in this particular Bible. It is on page 115. And Moses sends a scouting party ahead. And he chooses 12 people out of the tribe of Israel. I don't know if it's one from each of the tribes. I don't know exactly. But he chooses 12 people. Of those 12 people, one of them is Joshua, who becomes big into this story in a couple of books down the line. And another one is named Caleb, and the rest of them are kind of no names. And he sends them in as a scouting party to scout out, what is this promised land? What does it look like? And so they go into this promised land. And they hang out there and scout around and sneak around for like 40 days. And again, remember, there's these terms, the term 40, for the right amount of time. And when they've gotten a good feel for this land, then those 12 spies come back and give their report. Now, I want to talk about this report. So take a look at Numbers chapter 13, and then look at verse 25, and I'm going to read this to you. So, at the end of the 40 days, they is those 12 spies that they sent up into the promised land, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all of the congregation of the Israelites in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh Barnea. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. In other words, so what they did is that when they got into that, now remember, they've been in the wilderness. This wilderness is desert. There's no food there. God has provided every morsel of food, every drop of water. But the promised land is different. The land of Canaan produces food. Relies on the rain to produce food. There are grapes there. There's grain there. There are natural water sources there. It is different in Canaan than it is in the Sinai Peninsula. And so they bring back examples of this food. And it says this, and they told them, these spies told them, he says, we came to the land to which you sent us, and it flows with milk and honey. And this is the fruit. And they put down all of this fruit that they carried back with it. Yet, the people who live in the land are strong. Now remember, the promised land is not empty. It is full of other tribes of people. The famous 7 tribes, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and all the other ites. And included in that, in addition to those 7 tribes, are the Philistines. Now, the Philistines were come from a different race of people. Scholars say that probably the Hebrews, those descendants of Abraham, probably were very, very, very small people. You know, if you were 4'6", 4'10", less than 5 foot of people, and it makes sense. You know, if your food sources are pretty scarce, you know, you can't. You're just not going to be that big. You can't ingest enough food to maintain a big body. And so the Hebrews were probably pretty small people. Now the Philistines were not Hebrew people. They were people of a different origin. And the Philistines were bigger, normal-looking, to you and I, probably people that if you were a big Philistine person, a soldier, Goliath was a Philistine. And Goliath, you know, they said he was 9 cubits tall. Now, you know what a cubit is? A cubit is the distance between one's elbow and the tip of your finger. Now for us, now again, cubit, the size of a cubit is in the eye of the beholder. If you're a little person, you have a little cubit. So a child or a person who is 4'6", your cubit is not very tall. So let's say, now for me, my cubit is, now we use cubits all the time, or a lot of us do. What do you use your cubit for? When you sew, how do you measure a yard? 36. You do, so that's a half a yard, right? Right? Or 1 yard, 2 yards, 3 yards, 4 yards. You do it from that way, right? But see, now that's not an exact measurement, right? Because if you were a very big person, then your yards would be bigger. If you're a very small person, your yards would be smaller, right? Well, same with cubits. So if Goliath is 9 cubits tall, well, I mean, okay, let's say your cubit's only a small cubit. So, we're talking about these kind of inexact measurements. But all this to say that the Philistines who live in here are big people, much bigger than the Hebrews are. And notice what they say. So go back to this. Here, yeah, it is true. This is a land of milk and honey, but it says this. He says, yet, verse 28, the people who live there are strong, and the towns are fortified and very large. And besides that, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Or in other words, the children of the Nephilim. Giants. And then the Amalekites who live in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, they all live along the Jordan. So they're saying, yeah, this is the land of milk and honey. But folks, we're screwed. There's just no way we're ever going to be able to take over this land. We can't do it. What are we going to do? That was the majority report. But there was a minority report from this group of spies. So 10 of these spies come back and say, yeah, it's beautiful there, but there's no way we're ever going to be able to take it over. But the minority report, which was given by Caleb and Joshua, says this, verse 30. But Caleb says, quieted the people before Moses and said, now, we can do this. Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it. And then the men who had gone up with him said, and then the men come up, the other men said, we are not able to go up against this people, for they are stronger than we are. And so they brought to the Israelites an unfavorable report of the land that they had spied out, saying, this land that we have gone through as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim. And to ourselves, we seemed like grasshoppers in comparison to them. So you had a majority report, you had a minority report. And of course, when they bring these two reports to the Israelite people, they panic. They say, oh man. So they begin to shake their fist at God again and at Moses again. He says, you brought us out into this wilderness, if not to kill us by starvation, to kill us by this army. Again, then that committee of let's go back to Egypt starts going up again. We would have been better off if we would have just stayed in Egypt. And here is where God gets really, 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 really angry. And says, haven't you figured this out yet? Remember, they have been in the wilderness now they have been there for a year at this point. Every drop of water, every morsel of food has been provided by God themselves. And God says, fine, you don't deserve to go into the promised land. you're going to hang out here in the wilderness for another 39 years until this present generation has passed. Now, people say, well, that's horrible, horrible punishment. And I make the point that this is not punishment. This is discipline. And that's different. Because what God has to impose upon this group of people is that, look, folks, I will take care of you. I will take care of you. I have taken care of you every drop of water, every morsel of food for this year. I will do it for another 39 years until you finally learn that you can trust me. And that's what it looks like. That's why they wander around the wilderness for another 39 years. And that's thus the little curly Q there. Until finally, that generation, those leaders who said, no, we'll never get it, we're screwed, we're never going to be able to do this, passes. And we have a generation of people who have known nothing else but God's day-to-day provision. And now they're finally ready to go into the promised land. And so they go into that promised land, and they pass through. So, one of the things that Harry Wendt talks a lot about in this is he talks about bookends. And so this whole promised end, so bookends meaning that you see something at the beginning of a story and then follow that until you get to that same thing at the end of a story. And that's how you know you're at the beginning of a story and at the end of a story. The beginning of this story of the time in the wilderness is they pass through water. They pass through the Red Sea. And then at the end of this time in the wilderness is they pass through water again. This time it is the Jordan River. And some of the same things happen when they pass through the Jordan River as they pass through the Red Sea. One of the things that happens is that when they pass through the Jordan River, now remember there's a couple different things that are going on here. Moses leads them right up to that within sight. Mount Pisgah is within sight of the promised land, and Moses gives them one final message, and Moses dies before he enters into the promised land, which is always really sad to me. Now he's 120 years old, but nevertheless, it's like, oh, I mean, couldn't God just give him a couple of days there, whoo-hoo, I made it, and then die? No, it is, he dies before he even gets in there. And and they pass through this Jordan River, and one of these kind of cool scenes is that Moses sends the Ark of the Covenant. You know what the Ark of the Covenant is? The Ark of the Covenant, is you ever see Indiana Jones and the Ark of the Covenant? Well, that's what the Ark of the Covenant is that big chest that is carried by the priests, and inside of that chest is the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Was the staff that Moses used, to show God's power in Egypt. There's other things that get put into that sort of represents God's power. And when they get to the River Jordan, what happens with that is he sends the priests that are carrying that big tablet, that big chest, into the River Jordan. And as their feet touch the water, the River Jordan stops its flow, just like what happened in the Red Sea. It is like a dam is built there as they put their foot in there, and the people can cross the river without getting their feet wet. Same thing that happened in the Red Sea happens in the River Jordan. And then they can move into the promised land. Next week we're going to talk about what did this law that God gives at Mount Horeb, what did this look like? And we're going to talk about the pieces of that. And the history behind that is pretty interesting, actually. Something that's called a suzerainty treaty that looks a lot like treaties that were made in that particular day that archaeologists have found. And we'll talk about the individual pieces of that for next week.